Welcome everyone to the Living with Fire Islands Trust webinar. My name is Michaela Yanni and I am the Communications Specialist at Islands Trust Conservancy. Thank you so much for attending this webinar this evening to learn about living with fire in the Salish Sea. Before I begin, I would like to pass on our gratitude to Elder Robert George, a Cowichan Tribes member, who is going to welcome us today, but is now unfortunately unable to attend this evening. In lieu of Robert, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. I am grateful to live on such abundant lands, rich in diversity and beauty. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. Only the presenters will be able to speak today, but if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and passing on those questions when we get to our Q&A session. And this webinar will be recorded and you will be able to view it on our Stewardship Education webpage as soon as possible. We are hoping to finish promptly at 8:30 this evening, so we will get started right away. Our first presenter is Joe Gilchrist. Joe works to bring Indigenous cultural burning and traditional land stewardship to the forefront as a traditional firekeeper. I'll pass it off to you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Michaela. I'd like to thank everybody for having me here to present. Speaking to you from Skeetchison, uh, which is about 40 kilometers west of Kamloops, between Kamloops and Cache Creek on the Secwepemc Nation. I grew up in this area my whole life. I was born in Kelowna and uh, grew up here. Then we moved to Ashcroft and uh, lived most of my life in Merritt. A couple hours, a couple of years in Kamloops, and then moved back to Merritt again, where I began my firefighting career when I was 15 years old. Uh, and started with the Merritt Unit Crew in 1991. Um, I believe I was only 19 years old. Uh, and I was a squad boss the first year because I had already 5 years of experience or 4 years experience fighting fire. So um, then the next year I became the unit crew leader, and um, we traveled all over BC. We traveled all over Canada, uh, fighting fires. My boss from the Merritt Fire Zone was Tom Lacey, and way back, in the 1980s, he was interested in the idea of cultural burning, and he wanted to learn more, and he was reading books about it, and he really passed it on to us that there was such a thing as cultural burning. And as I gained more and more experience, he told me to talk to people across Canada, Indigenous people, about cultural burning and what they could remember, uh, why fire was used and when and where, and um, get as much information as I could as kind of like a side project, I guess. And so when I traveled to different areas around BC and Canada, I would talk, in the coffee house or the tent or trailer, or the if we were lucky enough to have a fire, we'd sit around a fire and we'd share stories about cultural burning. So got to learn quite a bit. And then in 1996, I went to Mission, British Columbia, to the St. Mary's Residential School, which at that time was the Indigenous Justice Institute, for a 16-week program. It was an in-house government program for Indigenous fire prevention technician training. And I completed that and got on full time with the Ministry of Forest. And uh, my first job in Merritt Fire Zone um, was to go through quite a few file boxes. I can't remember. It was more than 50 file boxes full of fire reports. And my job was to get the fire number, and it was 50 or 60 years of fires. So as far back as they had files for the Merritt Fire Zone, I would get the fire number, the date, the Latin long and geographic location, the cause of the fire, and and I would put that onto a spreadsheet. Uh, It took me quite a long time. I can't remember how long, but 2 or 3 months probably to go through all of that information and get it onto a database. And I gave it to my boss, who put it onto the GIS mapping, which was pretty new back then. And the GIS mapping put it into onto a map in a visual form where uh, fires that started in the springtime were in yellow, and the fires that started in the fall time were red, and lightning strike fires would be blue. Uh, and so the map of the Merritt Fire Zone that was really clear that spring burning by indigenous people, indigenous use of fire or cultural burning, um, and even in some cases we put down miscellaneous unknown, because what would happen is indigenous people would light a fire in their berry picking, uh, hunting areas, and they would just leave so they wouldn't get caught, because it's illegal to burn. So they would light the fire and they would leave. And those are miscellaneous unknown or suspected cultural burning or hot start. And so, anyways, the fires that started in the springtime were in the valley bottoms, and it was usually like around now, um, late February to April, May, and June was usually the rainy season. So up until June, and it was in the definitely in the lower elevations where it dried out first, and then as the heat began in the summertime, the alpine started to dry out also. So different elevations for different times of the year. But my point is that the indigenous people lit fires in the springtime for certain reasons, whether it was for hunting, for food gathering, for medicine, different medicines. And the other part of that is that in the fall time, uh, the higher elevation huckleberry, moose hunting, elk hunting, and deer hunting areas in the lodgepole pine and higher areas was burned, and deciduous stands like for mushrooms or for stinging nettle, different kinds of medicine, was burned in the fall time. And uh, it was really prevalent. Uh, it was enough to change our initial attack program that we did, so that in the springtime or the fall time, we would get a fire, and um, we would go out to these areas which we knew already were traditional places that were burned either in the spring or the fall, and that the reasons were clear was because indigenous people were using fire to enhance the land and to um, reduce the amount of fuel on the ground. And so rather than us going out and using air tankers and bulldozers and tearing the ground up and things like that, we went out and we found um, existing fuel breaks like roads, railroads, horse trails, deer trails, rivers and lakes, and we would burn to those areas um, and put in very little guard, as little as possible, and uh, and then we would let the fire burn out. And if we could, we would wait for the rain to come to do that. And if it was going to be a little extended before the rain come, we would put a pump in and we'd start mopping up. Uh, and of course, the spin-off effect for that was that we made relations with the First Nations people, and that um, fire wasn't a bad thing. You know, there was a good time to to use fire on the ground, which is the spring and the fall and the winter time. But in the summertime it was full suppression. Uh, but in that spring and fall time when it didn't burn as hot and the burning days were shorter and the fire was low intensity and it would just burn the material that would in the summertime it would be a catastrophic fire, but in the springtime and the fall time it was an enhancement, and we found that the targeted species by the First Nations people were enhanced and actually grew better, and at the same time, got rid of wood ticks and spiders and all kinds of things, and gave less places for mice and rats and things like that to hide, opened up the country so that the predators could see better for the mice and the rats and things like that. Talk about raptors and that the deer and moose and elk, they had safer places to have their babies in the springtime because their line of sight was farther. They didn't have to worry about getting snuck up on as much because the um, fuel was um, the sight lines was enhanced. So that we learned quite a bit about doing that, and uh, another thing that we also learned was that the indigenous people used fire on riparian areas around creeks and rivers um, for different reasons, for mushrooms, for um, better fishing areas, and for just a more healthy areas for different medicine that grows along the rivers and creeks. And uh, what that does, burning every 4 years in the fall time for um, the riparian areas, whether it's or if it's a meadow, you burn it every 2 years by a river, and but by doing that over thousands of years, the nutrition goes down into the ground, driven down by rain, and uh, it causes the roots to go down deeper into the ground. And if you look right now, and if you go there now, that the fire hasn't been there. It's missed something like at least 25 burn cycles over 100 years. One burn cycle is 4 years, so that would make 100 years would be 25 years. So that's 25 burn cycles missed. the roots along a creek or a river, if they're not washed away by now, they're rather than going down into the ground, they're going up because there's a layer of rotting forest material. Um, that's where the nutrition is, and that's where the roots come up. And if you rake that away, you can see that the roots are right there, and they shouldn't be. They should be down. Um, and so what that does is it causes instead of the roots to hold on where they should be, now they become a mat, and then the water during flood events, whether it's with our changing climate, we have some really bad rain events now, or else just the springtime um, burning. Like just not too long ago, it was really cold. Now all of a sudden it's warm and it's raining, and it puts a lot of pressure on our water systems. And when it flash floods like that, the water gets underneath of the roots and around, and it could also, that's why you see some trees leaning into the creek and river. That means that the roots are starting to fall in, and that's going eventually it's going to get washed away. And a really bad example of that is between Merritt and Spencer's Bridge on the Nicola River. We had the new atmospheric river event that happened there, and there's about 500 meters of cobblestone now, which used to be um, cottonwood, some birch, poplar, alder, willow, all that kind of riparian that should have been healthy enough to withstand um, a flood, but because it wasn't burned for so long, it was just washed away, and now we're left with really poor uh, salmon habitats because the water gets too warm, and there's no sun, there's no shade, and all kinds of things. No, if another thing about just talking about that is uh, the reintroduction of beavers, because beavers were just about hunted to extinction. But you can't just bring the beavers back to enhance the area. You have to first enhance the uh, riparian areas first, because one beaver eats 100 trees per year. And so if the area that you introduce them to doesn't have that, they'll just leave when they run out of food. And so first you have to enhance uh, the riparian area, then introduce the beavers, and then you can hopefully slow the water down. Um, and while I guess I'm on water, as we go in farther into climate change, and we get hotter and drier summers. When I was young, in the 70s, we never had smoked out days. We never, summers just, when you're a kid, it just seemed to last forever. And now the summers are just about getting to a point where you dread um, smoke in the air because you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know how close the fire is, and uh, I guess it's even causing people not to come and visit for tourism and things like that. So we're getting quite an effect from wildfires that um, can't really be seen, but we can really feel it. And now the insurance companies are talking about not insuring homes because from wildfire. And of course, insurance is going up because of the California fires and different fires that are to do with, you know, wildfires and how are we going to lessen the amount of fuel and things like that. One story that was told to me by an elder in the Merritt area. Uh, he's around 90 now, but he used to ride from um, Douglas Lake to Kelowna to Penticton and to Kamloops. And when he was little, uh, um, and the forests were thin and mostly grassland. The ponds are full of water and ducks and wildlife and frogs and turtles and all that kind of stuff. And now he says that nowadays the forests are thick and you can't ride a horse through, and all of the ponds are dried up because of there's so much trees that it just doesn't allow the water to get into the ponds. So the ponds are dried up now. So how do we get back to a safer community is the main thing. You have to worry about where people live first, and then worry about hunting areas and fishing areas and all that. But if you worry about where you live, you got to think of the fuel that you're living in, whether it's sagebrush, whether it's ponderosa pine fir, Douglas fir, or on the coast would be the coastal cedar and uh, um, Douglas fir and hemlock. Um, you think about how it burns, and we're just starting to see fire on the coastal areas now that generally are few and far between, but it's getting to be more prevalent, and uh, and it's going to become more and more intense as climate change. We have more and longer burn days, days where fire is available, whether it's the above 30 degrees Celsius and below 30% RH. And of course, with the winds and the amount of fuel, so you think about the Kelowna fire. The Kelowna fire only has about 10 to 15 centimeters of a duff layer. And if you think about the coastal duff layer, uh, like a meter and a half thick, uh, which is a driver of the intensity of the fire. So when that dries out and the the trees it's been so long since it's burned that uh, you can't walk through the forest because it's just too thick. And of the dead trees that are down, all the fuel that's on the ground, the fires are going to be super intense and very catastrophic. And I don't think that there's enough escape routes for people. And so people got to start changing their mind about what a beautiful forest looks like. You can't just let the forest be anymore without um, stewarding it. Indigenous people have done it for thousands and thousands of years. Um, the trees were big. They were spread apart. Uh, there was a good water supply. There was diversity, and how do you go from how it was back then, how it is now, and then how to bring that into the future so that we can give that to our children and grandchildren, which is the indigenous people call the seven generational thinking. That's fire stewardship or land stewardship that has been used for thousands of years in Turtle Island or North America. You go back 3 to 4 generations and you remember the stories and the songs of the land where people used to pick, where they hunted, where they fished, where they, moved through the land and which areas needed to be burned and when, and then where things need to be burned right now if you're picking an area and it's too thick, and when you leave the area, you're going to light it on fire, and the next few years it's going to be good to go back to. And then you think about all of that, you pass that knowledge on to the children, the grandchildren, and the ones that aren't born yet, the ones that can't speak, and they continue that on, so that the future always has is always giving to us. Uh, if we don't do anything like we are now, if the land does what it wants to do, it grows thicker, the trees grow tall, the next ones come in, it makes the other ones sick and they fall down, and the other ones grow, and underbrush grows and grass, and it just turns into a real mess with different diseases and insects. Um, and that's what we're seeing in our forests now. That's not a healthy forest. That's not a beautiful forest. It's becoming more and more of a danger to humans and our way of life. And so we have to uh, accept that it's not natural, it's not beautiful, and we have to look back in history and see how the land was treated, how it was done, and then we have to be able to apply that and make our best attempts to get it back the way that it was, and pass that knowledge on so that the next generations coming can carry on and try to keep as safe as possible. Yeah, so thank you very much for letting me speak. It's, looking forward to some questions and stuff later on.
Thank you so much, Joe, for sharing your history and knowledge with us. And I wrote down a couple of your key points, thinking about the fuel that we live in. I think that's so important. And also, just a personal takeaway, like changing perceptions around what a beautiful forest looks like. I'm definitely going to think about that moving forward. So thank you so much for all that incredible knowledge. I am now going to welcome Connor Corbett, who is a registered professional forester with 15 years of experience in wildfire. Hi, Connor, and I will just share
Hello.
the screen with your presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Like I was just introduced, my name is Connor. I'm a registered professional forester. My bread and butter, all I do is wildfire consulting. I work for a firm in North Vancouver called Frontera Forest Solutions, and I have done quite a bit of work in the Gulf Islands and in the similar ecosystems of southern Vancouver Island, and even those ecosystems that are on the mainland. And I think Joe really set the stage really well there for a lot of things that I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be echoing a lot of the sentiments that he expressed there. And really, what I'm going to be talking about is fire smart. And I know everyone here has just heard fire smart, fire smart, fire smart all the time. It's everywhere. And I really want to talk about what that actually means, because it can be a little bit of a buzzword. It can be a little bit vague and confusing. And I just want to kind of distill that out into what we as wildfire practitioners really mean by fire smart, and what people here as residents can take away from this, and why we're emphasizing this all the time. Next slide, please. So Wildfire risk in the Gulf Islands. Sorry, back to the last one, Michaela. Back to the slide that says wildfire risk in the Gulf Islands. Yeah, so what are the realities? We don't need to do like a really deep dive into what's causing wildfire risk, what all the factors are. I'm just going to summarize this as briefly as I can. And of course, we can revisit this with questions after I'm finished presenting. But essentially, like Joe was saying, the forest and the forested landscapes of the Gulf Islands are really different from what they were before colonization. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I'm happy to discuss. I don't want to get too into it, but essentially, before colonization, wildfires were much more frequent, but much smaller and really low intensity. And that really impacted what our forests look like with these fire managed ecosystems where we'd have a really diverse landscape with lots of large mature trees that were really spaced out, lots of meadows, and these fires would clean out lots of the understory and dead material that we would see on the forest floor. But since colonization and because of a bunch of different factors, our forests are really different now. They're much denser, there's much more vegetation, there's a lot of material that accumulates in the understory. Trees just aren't as big, and that's a combination of things like logging, historic logging, that has changed that. But it's harder for trees to become large because of a lot of different factors. And all that means, all that stuff I just threw out at you means that when wildfires occur, there's a lot more vegetation fuel for wildfires in these forests, and it is structured in a way that can support much more intense wildfires than we would naturally see. And I know, and when I say natural, I mean in the pre-colonization ecosystem regime we would see here. And I know we haven't seen a lot of those fires yet because this current situation has taken decades and decades for us to get to, and we really just haven't seen it yet. But that recent experience, it really is not true for what we can expect in the future. And we also just have a lot more stuff that we've built into these forested landscapes. We have homes, structures, critical infrastructure dispersed widely throughout this forest. I like to think the Gulf Islands are really communities that are embedded in the forest instead of what we might see on the mainland, where we might see a really urban developed community with a very discrete interface with the forest. So you have your city and then your forest. On the Gulf Islands, our community is very much mixed in with that forest. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And so this is just a nice visual example of what I think these historic wildfires, pre-colonization wildfires, might have looked like. This is from a prescribed burn just outside Machosin. And this is an area that they burn very regularly. And when I say very regularly, I mean almost annually. And this is some of my old colleagues at the BC Wildfire Service doing this burn here. And you can see the fire intensity is really low. Like the flame lengths are definitely less than 30 centimeters long. You can see these firefighters are quite comfortable standing right beside it. I think this wouldn't be something you would feel too uncomfortable being too close to. It's spreading very slowly. And you can see a lot of these trees that are present here that have probably survived multiple rounds of burning, and they're not getting affected. I mean, by affected, I mean killed by these burns. And these are really, really good fires for ecosystem health. They're getting rid of this grass before it gets too long and becomes an actual hazard. And this is really nice visual of what a lot of those pre-colonization historic wildfires would probably have looked like. Low intensity, low rates of spread, probably not getting that big, and a lot of the mature vegetation surviving and tolerating them, and they're cleaning out a lot of that dead debris and material. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And so this is I pulled this from the Gulfstream News Gazette, a news article about a wildfire on the Malahat Highway in 2023. This is a natural wildfire, an uncontrolled wildfire. And I think the difference here is quite stark. I know that this photo is like very low quality, but This is the type of wildfire that is just much more intense. And I'm a former firefighter myself, just like Joe. And this is the type of wildfire that this is scary. This is something that you would not really want to be too close to. Those flame lengths are quite long. I know there's not a lot of scale, but well over a meter. And you can see tons of exposed rock from where the fire is burnt. So we're seeing a lot of material getting consumed in this fire and having pretty severe impacts to the health of this ecosystem. Whereas on the previous slide, a lot of the subsurface soil would have been pretty unaffected because the fire is just not intense enough. And so to summarize everything that we're saying here is that what's happened in the past is not a good indicator of what's going to happen in the future because of how our forests have changed. And to throw another wrench in the works, we have climate change, which is changing everything. It's upending everything. And we don't completely understand what these impacts are going to mean, but we have really strong evidence that it is going to make fires more intense and more severe than they've been in the past. And that's a problem that's not going away anytime soon. So I'll just go to the next slide, please. So just to summarize, wildfires are possible to likely. The consequences can be severe because we have these communities embedded in the forest, and the wildfire risk is increasing. And that's a combination of factors driving that, like forest composition and climate change. But I think the big picture is that this problem is not going away. And the factors that are driving this problem are very significant. And these are not problems that are going to be resolved on any meaningful scale. There is just, the problems are too big, there's too much of an area, and there's not really feasible ways to reduce the factors that are driving that wildfire risk. We are not going to be solving climate change at a community scale. And even if we do take significant action for climate change, it is going to be many years before that bears fruit in adjusting our local weather. Our forests are very widespread. They are very overgrown or denser than they would naturally be. And even if there was an appetite for large scale forest management to adjust these forests, it's not feasible. The scale is massive. And that might be something that scares people. And I'm not trying to scare people, because I think one of the important things to know is that there actually are things that we can do on a meaningful scale to reduce our vulnerability to this wildfire risk. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation, is coexisting with wildfire. And I'll go to the next slide. And that's what Fire Smart means to me. And that's the message that I'm always trying to drill with people, is that wildfire risk is not going away, and so we can't really change the wildfire risk in any area just because the problem is so large. But what we can do is learn how to coexist with wildfire and with that wildfire risk. And what that means is reducing our vulnerability and the vulnerability of our communities to these impacts of wildfire. Fire Smart, to me, it means living with wildfire risk and living in such a way that we can tolerate the potential impacts of wildfire risk. And that's also what we mean when we say wildfire resiliency. It means we're acknowledging that wildfire can happen and severe wildfire can happen, but our ways of life and our communities can emerge intact or relatively intact from any of these events. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And so Fire Smart, what's the reality of that? The reality of our wildfire situation and how we live in these forests, we cannot eliminate risk and we cannot eliminate vulnerability to that risk. That's just a fact. And even if you live in a concrete bunker surrounded by gravel in 100 meters in every direction, there's still going to be a little bit of vulnerability to wildfire. These are really powerful natural forces that are really unpredictable. But what we can do is take practical actions to reduce vulnerability at really small scale. And when I say that, I mean as individual property owners, as community members, and acknowledge that, yes, we can't get rid of all these vulnerabilities, but we can significantly reduce the vulnerabilities. And we can do that through some small actions, some medium actions, and some big actions. But even the small actions have huge benefits to reducing the vulnerability of our structures, our ways of life, and our communities. And I'll go to the next slide, please. So Fire Smart, where to start? I always like to tell this story, and I'm sure some people maybe have heard me talk before about this. My parents are retired. They live in the Rockies, and they live in an extremely fire-prone area close to the Columbia Trench, where there are huge wildfires every year. And they live in essentially a cabin in the woods, and their house is basically an example of what not to do for fire smart living. Everything is wood. There's trees everywhere. There's junk and combustible material everywhere. And in the last couple of years through this work, as they've moved to this new home, they've been kind of asking me, they've been getting concerned about wildfires, seeing these impacts, seeing everything in the news, and kind of asking me where to start. And I gave them the same advice I give to everybody else. You have to start by knowing what the problem is and knowing where those problems are. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen with my parents and I've seen with people I talk to is that it just feels like the problem is so overwhelmingly big that it creates this tremendous sense of anxiety, and it can be paralyzing. It just feels like it's too big and there's nothing you can do. And so I told them the same thing I tell everybody else is, let's figure out what the problem is, and then we can figure out what we can do about it. And so for them and for anyone is just start with a really open and honest assessment of your home or of whatever you're trying to reduce the vulnerability of. There's tons of resources, and I'm sure for the most part, everyone here probably is in a community that has a FireSmart web page. It might even have a local FireSmart representative or local FireSmart ambassador. And these are people that their job is to help you, and their job is to provide resources, and in a lot of cases, even provide assessments. And these are your assessments. These people, they do it and they give it to you. They don't keep this information. They don't squirrel it away to sneak off to some insurance providers. This is your information. And even if you don't have those resources available to you, there are a lot of resources that can walk you through the process so that you can do it yourself. Honestly, it's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. My parents live 12 hours away, and I just sent them the guide and they were able to do it themselves. And I think what this guide really does is it helps you identify all the vulnerabilities. They've really evolved the guide really well, where it's basically a simple yes or no. Does your structure have this component that might make it vulnerable? Yes or no. And there's about 20 or 30 of these items, and it's essentially a checklist. And once you go through it and you complete this assessment, it doesn't take very long. What you'll see, it'll basically generate a list of all the vulnerabilities on whatever you're assessing. And once you have those, the plan is kind of writing itself, because you have this list of all these different items. And what I suggest to anyone who asks me about this is just make this list in one column, and beside it, just estimate the level of effort and cost that's going to be associated with dealing with this. And I think a lot of my clients and a lot of people I work with, my parents included, were pretty surprised to see how easy a lot of these things were to take care of. So, for example, for my parents' house, my dad had a bunch of offcuts from a carpentry project underneath their deck. It took him about half an hour to get rid of those and move those, which was something he probably should have been doing anyway. And so that was something that not only did it reduce the vulnerability of his home, it was just part of his regular landscaping maintenance. And there's going to be a lot of stuff like that that's just taken care of really easily and really quickly. There's going to be other things that you're going to have to do repeatedly. And that's things like cleaning out your gutters, sweeping off your deck, just general maintenance, things like that. And that's kind of things that you have to work into just how you live in the forest with these vulnerabilities. And I always recommend take care of the easy stuff first, because that you'll start to build momentum and you'll start to get this sense of satisfaction. And it'll give you peace of mind to know that you're doing something that is helping reduce the vulnerability. But at the same time, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are going to be some pretty big vulnerabilities that are going to be really challenging to deal with. And they might be challenging in terms of level of effort. They might be challenging in terms of cost. They might be challenging in terms of transformative to where you live and how you live there. And those can be difficult decisions. And some of those things, like if the barrier is level of effort and level of cost, I always recommend, well, let's plan this out over a long time frame. Like this isn't something that's going to be taken care of today or tomorrow. Examples I can think of is replacing the siding or replacing your roof. Those are big projects and expensive projects. And those are things that you do really need to plan out and also contextualize into the other parts of home maintenance. So let's say maybe you have a cedar shake roof. Those things do have a service life. And so maybe the option is at the end of this service life of this particular part of my home, I'm going to replace it with something fire smart. And that might be in 3 years. And that's totally fine. I totally understand. And I think you're accepting a certain amount of vulnerability with that, but everything needs to be balanced out for what's feasible and what's pragmatic. And the final piece, I think, belaboring this a little bit, is just don't be too hard on yourself and don't let perfect be the enemy of good. You really need to identify the trade-offs on certain decisions between what Fire Smart says and all the other things that you value in the way you live with the forest. So, for example, Fire Smart might say, you need to remove this tree that's 8 meters away from your house. And you might have just hung up a tire swing in there last year for your kids. And that tree is really, really important to you and your family. Well, and you say, removing this tree really isn't something we want to do. And I think the important thing to remember is there are other options for certain things like that. And you can just say, I don't want to remove this tree. Maybe we can prune it instead. Maybe we can do something not quite at the level of removal, but we can reduce the vulnerability, prune it away from the house, create a little bit of more clearance. I think the one thing I like to stress is be intentional about these choices and really weigh the vulnerabilities with the other important things that these things are providing to you, and just understand and accept that and say, look, this decision I've made does create a vulnerability, and by not doing anything about it, I am accepting that. And that's just something I really advise everyone to do. And I'll go to the next slide. I always like to show this graphic just because it is a nice visual, but I also caution everyone that I know probably no one in this webinar's home or property or any home or property in the Gulf Islands looks like this. I admire that. I think this is aspirational, and I think this is something we should all be striving for, but don't stress yourself out or make yourself concerned that your property doesn't look like this. Try and focus on the elements that you can control and are reasonable for you to control. It's a great reference, but don't think that your house needs to look like this for you to be living in an area of wildfire risk. I'll go to the next slide, please. And this is my final slide here, and I think something I just want to finish on is that we are trying with this Fire Smart thing we're trying to emphasize for everyone is we're trying to emphasize that we all need to understand that we need to live and coexist with our natural environment in a new way. Things have changed. We can't just keep doing what we've been doing for the last decades and decades. We have an emerging wildfire risk that is significant, and the way we live currently is making us vulnerable to wildfire. And it takes a lot of work. This is going to happen overnight, and you need to constantly be revisiting it. I always say it's like trying to kick a bad habit. You're trying to take on a good habit, and it's not easy to do. And we just need to be constantly reevaluating our decisions. The understanding of wildfire risk is also evolving. and our understanding of it evolves, and what we need to do evolves. So we're really good, I think, with some of this fire smart stuff about constantly changing it to match up with what we know about wildfire risk. But what that means is that we also need to be adapting with how we live. Wildfire risk is not going away, it's here to stay. And the best way to deal with it is reducing our vulnerability as much as we can and starting to coexist with this risk. Um, Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Connor. That was an incredible presentation. So many great tidbits that I took away from that as well. And I really loved what you shared around don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And all the small practical steps and easy steps that people can take to reduce their fire risk on their properties or in their communities. So thank you so much. We're now going to move into a question period for both of our presenters. And so thank you so much to everyone for putting questions in the chat. A first question here. So a question for Joe. So can you tell us some more about burning at higher elevations versus at lower elevations?
Yeah, so the high elevation, like ski areas, are a different field type, whether it's lodgepole pine, um, spruce balsam, or true fir. Uh, the spruce balsam true fir fire cycle is 100 to 200 years, which means that it burns every 100 to 200 years, and it's a stand replacing fire, which also means that the whole forest burns. It's natural, and it's really dangerous that people have chosen to put their houses in these areas because uh, if it misses the burn cycles, it just falls to the ground, and the new forest comes up, and that fuel stays, and it adds on to more and more dangerous conditions for housing or ski areas in those high elevation areas. To to break that up, indigenous people would have burned for different reasons, whether it's for mushrooms, for huckleberries, for hunting, for meadows, for um, different medicines that grow under different conditions and different aspects of the mountains and elevations. Um, the fires generally would have been burned um, in the fall time, after a rainfall. So you have the summertime, and then you have a bit of rain, and that bit of rain will soak into the ground. And when it gets soaked into the ground, and then you're able to light fires again, then that's a great time to use fire because you'll burn the top layer, but you won't affect the roots, and the roots will be saved for the coming spring. So that's one way to burn in the fall time. The other way is to actually break the whole 100 to 200 year burn cycle. And if it's a meadow, you burn every 2 years for thousands of years. You just burn every 2 years, and that meadow will stay a meadow as long as you burn. And same as huckleberry patch. You burn every 4 years in the fall time, and any new growth of conifer trees, the seedlings will be burnt, and that if you burn every 4 years, it'll stay a really good producing huckleberry patch. And you've got to make sure that it's been after rain and you're expecting rain, and that kind of stuff, so that the ground is actually nourishing itself. And you burn every 4 years for thousands of years, and that'll stay a huckleberry patch. And that's always what's been done before contact. Uh, and I really hope that um, people can picture this in their mind about the how indigenous people used fire as a tool to steward the land, but to also make the areas safe from fire as much as possible. And cultural burning is that way that uh, the communities and things like that were made safe.
Amazing. A follow-up question on that. Someone asked, do you see a move towards encouraging more cultural burning across BC?
Yeah, actually, I just came back from Australia for a trip there, and with the indigenous people talking about land stewardship and cultural burning, and um, I have friends in California and down in other parts of the U.S. and uh, we just started a Canada, U.S., Mexico table. So yeah, North America and Canada and especially British Columbia, it's becoming more and more of a subject that needs to be talked about more, needs to be more accepted by governments and by communities and the whole society. It's we have to keep ourselves safe, and one of the tools that was used for thousands and thousands of years was fire. Fire was used by indigenous people all across BC and all across Canada and around the globe, uh, our globe. Uh, fire was the thing that enhanced our food and our medicine and everything that we do. Our air and our water was kept clean with the use of fire. My grandmother, one of my uh, things that my grandmother would say was that water is the cleanser of the human body and fire is the cleanser of Mother Earth.
Beautiful. Yeah, really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing, Joe. Someone else asks here, on Bowen, we live in the most biodiverse areas and there are various types of sensitive ecosystems. Where can we find information about Fire Smart while retaining or transitioning functioning ecosystems? So an answer for either or question for either Connor or Joe. Both welcome to jump in as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think this is a question we get a lot. I think the easy answer is ask a biologist, but not probably very realistic and not something that's going to be super helpful. But I think what I usually recommend is when people are approaching this fire smart thing, the first thing to remember is that like what we're recommending is usually really, really light and really, really lightly impactful on these sensitive ecosystems. I've worked in the sensitive ecosystems of the CDF extensively, and we have always been able to do fire smart or vegetation management in pretty much everywhere that we've encountered. And our general rule of thumb is to start with a really light touch. And I think in these particular circumstances, like on Bowen Island, I would suggest starting from the structure out and really starting light. And so when I say starting light, I mean starting with some pruning, just some vegetation cleanup, and sticking as like basically within 10 meters of the house. And the total area that you're going to be working around is very, very small. And it's not like we're going to be bringing in heavy equipment and the logging companies to do this work. It's going to all be done by hand, and it's all going to be done very, very lightly and in a very, very low impact way to the ecosystem. I'm being really careful here because I don't know exactly the circumstances of what you're talking about, and I don't want to say do whatever you want because that's probably terrible advice without knowing exactly what's happening. But I think the best option is to start light from the structure out, and if you're really unsure, reach out to one of any of the local resources that you might have. And I know Bowen Island does have a pretty comprehensive Fire Smart program. So if you just Google Bowen Island Fire Smart, there'll be a whole host of resources, and I'm sure there's even someone that'll come out and take a look and give you some more detailed advice.
Thanks, Connor. Joe, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just echoing what Connor said about starting from your home and working your way out. You have to make sure that your area is safe and if you're going to use fire, there's options to burn in the wintertime. You can take your debris, woody debris and stuff like that. If you can't get rid of it one way, you can pile it and burn it in the wintertime when there's snow or a lot of rain. Um, a lot of places have missed so many burn cycles now that the forest is really dense and really dangerous to fires in July, August, and now even September. Um, so yeah, just starting from your house and working out, and then your community, your entire community, and that way is probably the best way to get started.
Thanks. And Connor, someone asks, are the resources that you mentioned, they're available online? So you talk about the Fire Smart and just, what can people type into Google to pull up these resources that you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, everyone here lives in different places, but I think the first start I would do is just say, where do you live? Followed by Fire Smart. So if you live on Gabriola Island, just say Gabriola Island Fire Smart, Galliano Island Fire Smart, et cetera, et cetera. I think for the most part, everywhere should have a local website at the very least. And I think most of these communities actually would have an actual staff member. But in the unlikely event, there's always going to be FireSmart BC, and that has tons of resources. They're a little broad, obviously, because it's a BC wide program, but it's certainly better than nothing. And I think you can really get a lot of value out of those resources at the very least.
That's great. Thank you. So another question, someone asks, we have had a large die-off of cedars over the past few years. On my property, a forested property in the Gulf Islands, there are probably 100 dead stems of different sizes. What would you recommend we do with these?
Yeah, I think that's something we're seeing a lot. There's been a lot of cedar dieback with quite a pretty significant droughts in the CDF. And I just saw another question asking if CDF is Coastal Douglas Fir Ecosystem. Yes, that's what I mean. I'm sorry for using an acronym. I try not to, but they always just slip in. But back to the question of cedar die-off. I think there's a bit of a misconception that all dead trees are fire hazards and bad and problems. And I certainly wouldn't recommend going out there and hiring someone to remove all 100 of those trees. Dead trees are really valuable. They provide a lot of habitat, they provide a lot of nutrients to the forest, and they're not necessarily a fire hazard. I think if it was me, I would probably get rid of all these dead trees that are within 10 to 15 meters of the house, not only because of a fire risk, but also because dead trees in near houses isn't a good mix. But yeah, I definitely would just say identify the trees that are close to the house, see how far away they are. If they're within 10 or 15 meters of your house or any structure, I would probably get rid of them and get rid of the debris as well. Standing dead cedar makes great firewood, so it's a good stuff to have for the wood stove. But yeah, that would be my advice: is just try and get rid of the stuff that's close to the house, and I wouldn't worry too much about any of these trees that are, further than 20 or 30 meters away. I think let nature do its thing.
Great advice. Thank you. Joe, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, of course, diversity. The uh, bugs and the birds really love the dead trees and raptors and things like that too. And for our own safety and things like that, just talking about wildfires and the climate change and the dangers of fires that it's a hazard for sure. It's a risk that you're leaving it there, and to um, just to take an account of the placement of the trees and to housing and things like that, whether they should be removed um, from uh, fire danger perspective, and I, that the if you're going to keep it, then you can take the smaller trees around it so that there's less ladder fuel and things like that. So just really planning the area and reducing fuel is the main thing to think about when a wildfire is encroaching. A good example is Jasper was ready. You know, they did the fire smart. They did everything that they did. They were even doing some cultural burning type fires, and it just the spotting distance of where they live is 5 kilometers. So you know that's a lot of area to make safe around your community. If your community and then you work out 5 kilometers from a wildfire and it still spots into your town, you know, at least that gives the firefighters a safe place to fight fires from. But that spotting distance it really has to be a part of safe community planning for wildfire mitigation.
Yeah, great points. Thanks, Joe. Another question for you, Joe. Ruth Waldick asks, thank you for sharing your knowledge. My question is, I wonder if you can describe what a cultural burn looks like as it is burning. Our innate fear of fire may have us imagining a raging fire somewhat like the one Connor showed in his images.
Yeah, so a cultural burn before contact was really um, small. It wasn't by small I mean the flame lengths, you know, were not dangerous because over thousands of years, you know, fire was used already in different mosaics of fuel and age classes of trees and different tree types. Meadows were built, you know, beavers were prevalent back then, and you know, we had plenty of water here and there, and so the fires were small. They were burned at such a time in the springtime or the fall time that it would only burn for, you know, maybe like a week or two, and it would be put out by the rain or cold weather. Nowadays, when I do my cultural burning, I I use existing fuel breaks, whether it's creeks and rivers or lakes or ponds, railroad tracks, roadways, horse trails, deer trails, and I keep it confined to that area. And I usually do what's called a black line. So a black line is you take the direction of the wind, which way it's going to go, or the slope, and you burn in front of it. You burn if there's a road there, you'd burn so that it burns to the road. That creates a black area called the black line, and then you layer back from there, and then the fire doesn't not if you lit in the bottom, it would grow intensity and then it would jump over. But if you light it on top and layer it back, and then you don't get the intensity, and the fire will eventually put itself out, and you might have some mop up because of smoke. Some people don't like smoke at nighttime. If it's going to be a high pressure uh, weather event, then smoke will stay. And if it's going to be low pressure, then the smoke will get taken away generally. Um, so yeah, there's quite a bit of things to think about before you start a cultural burn, and you know the reasons. You know, of course, for medicine and for different mushrooms and plants and berries and deer and elk and you know all kinds of wildlife that and the health of the ecosystem itself. You know, requires fire to stay healthy.
Great. Really, really interesting. Thanks, Joe, for sharing. So we have a question here, another question for you, Joe. What role can local governments play in supporting cultural burning initiatives?
Yeah, so it's really hard right now to burn off the Indian Reserve. Um, it takes a 5 years to plan to do a burn plan and to get the permits and things like that to burn off the reserve. So we really need changes in government management of the land and the laws and the legislation and policies and all kinds of things to be able to get fire back on the land in a good way, right? Not, you don't want people just lighting fires. You want it to be controlled the way that it should be, that people should be safe, and that by using fire, that the communities become safer and safer and safer, and that the wildfire branch, the I was saying that last year, I believe that I heard on the news that the wildfire branch's budget for last year's fire season was $800 million. And so, if you can chip away at the fuels around communities and housing and, give the firefighters a chance to get to fight the fires from a safe area, like the fire smarted areas, and be able to keep losses of property and that stuff down, then the wildfire branch's budget will slowly come down also, which will, add more money into prevention and mitigation. So yeah, there's quite a bit that, the whole society and governments need to do to start changing the way that the the land is managed.
Great. And another question here for you, Joe. What would a minimum footprint of a cultural burn be?
Well, yeah, it just whatever's available. I think I'm going to be doing a burn in Cranbrook in a couple of weeks, and people from Australia and the US and everybody is going to be there to watch, and it's only going to be 10 by 20 meters, so it's going to be surrounded by roads, and so there's really no chance of it to get away, and um, so I think it could be just as small as a as a burn pile. You know, a long time ago, fire was used 365 days a year to cook, to clean, to boil water and that kind of stuff. And it was the people's jobs to go out and get the fuels from the trees and from that were down on the ground and carry it back and burn it on these piles all year round, right? So that we'd always have something to cook from and clean from. And at the same time that was happening, we were reducing the fuel around our communities. So it could be just as simple as a pile that you take all your debris from and you take it to and you burn it at a safe time. In the fall time when it's rainy or during the winter time when there's snow on the ground.
That's really exciting and neat that you're doing that burn with so many people from different countries really soon. That's excellent. Another question for you, Connor. So, do you recommend removing the laddering factor with large tree branches? And if you don't want to remove big trees near your home?
Yeah, for sure. I think when we think about like trees and branches and reducing vulnerability, what we really want is to be creating space as much as possible. So creating space between our homes and the branches and foliage of the tree. It's the like on a coniferous tree, like a Douglas fir or a cedar, it's those needles that are really flammable, far more so than the actual tree trunk or stem. And so that's what we're really wanting to create as much clearance as possible from. I think the fire smart guidance is, it really lacks nuance. It's not really designed for places like where we live, where you can have these huge trees that are 40 meters tall. It's really for more situations in the interior where there's just not really small trees, where you can't really prune them without essentially removing all the branches, and then you may as well just remove the whole thing. And so what we want to do is we just be creating those gaps. So yes, pruning is great. Create as much space as you can between your structure and the branches. Create as much space as is reasonable between the surface, the soil surface, and the lower branches. Usually we say 5 to 10 meters. That's just a good rule of thumb. And then not just vertical spacing, we also want to create like horizontal spacing. So if you have tree branches that are touching, maybe you can prune them to create more of this horizontal separation. But essentially, the simple answer is just create as much space as you can between your home and the tree branches, and between trees and their neighbors and other tree branches.
Got it. Thank you. Super neat. Well, seeing no new questions in the chat, I have a couple questions for you both that I'm going to ask. And then in the meantime, if anybody has any further questions that they would like to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat. We still have around 15 minutes until we finish off our webinar for the night. And there's no new questions in between now and then we will say good evening. So I'd love to hear from both of you. Do you have any advice for changing people's minds? You both talked a lot tonight around changing the perception around fire. Do you have any advice just through, conversations that you've had with friends, families, colleagues around, changing people's perceptions and fear around fire?
Yeah, that's a real tough one, to change the whole society's thinking on fire, because we were just finished watching on the news California burn, and before that, watching Jasper, and then Hawaii, and what was that place in northern Alberta? But anyway, so yeah, so uh, to to see that there is a difference between catastrophic fire in the summertime and wanted fire, or fire prevention, or wildfire mitigation, or cultural burning, or all these different kind of fires that are good fires that could be used on the shoulder seasons, whether it's springtime or fall time, or even in the wintertime, like pile burning. That there is a difference in fires, and it's not just the bad catastrophic fires, but there's also ways of using fire as a tool, and instead of you know piling it all in your truck and taking it away, then there's an easier way of getting rid of that debris. And if you can use wildfire, or I'm sorry, if you can use fire as a tool, cultural burning, or um, prescribed burning, uh, or just keeping your fire small, like under, what's a 0.1 of a hectare or something, whatever the wildfire branch calls uh, campfire size, and just keep feeding it, right? Just keep feeding that fire, and you'll get rid of a lot of fuel.
Thanks so much for sharing, Joe. Connor, did you want to jump in and add anything there?
Yeah, for sure. I think every time we get like a catastrophic wildfire, like the tragedy that just happened in LA, I think I myself get lots of questions about that. And I think it's really difficult to explain to people who are asking me this, like when we see these catastrophic wildfires like Maui or LA, and we live on the coast of BC, I think it's really tricky to say, we're not there. Like, this isn't a situation that we're really concerned about. Like, that is a totally different context and a totally different wildfire risk profile. But I think a lot of people might hear that and say, oh, we don't need to worry about that then. We don't need to worry about wildfires. Or people will say, even without asking, you might just say, LA, California, hot, warm, like, it's totally different. That could never happen here. And I think what I prefer to say to tell people is, yes, that exact situation is very, very unlikely, but that does not mean it's something we should not be worrying about at all. And what would have to happen to mitigate wildfire risk in those situations is very different from what I would recommend in our current situation. And yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things that I've really struggled with is adding this nuance between either people are totally terrified all of North Vancouver is going to burn down versus not worried about it at all. We're really in the middle of that spectrum. And that's something I really try to explain to people.
And so that's really where the fire smart and the education pieces come in, right? And that's why it's so important to, even in webinars like this, to encourage people to take these small steps now so that we can prevent those larger events from happening. Is that correct? Am I correct in saying that?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm nodding emphatically.
Yeah, and definitely, think about escape routes too. Hey, whether it's earthquakes or whatever kind of hazards, there's more hazards than wildfires, but always make sure that you have escape routes planned and um, that you ensure that you and your family and loved ones are safe.
Yeah, for sure. Very important. All right, we have a couple other questions that came up while we were chatting. So, Connor, there's a follow-up question for you from the individual who asked about the laddering factor with large tree branches. So this individual asks, based on the laddering question, are you suggesting thinning stands so more sun and wind get in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think when I think thinning is a bit of a vague word. Like, when I think of thinning a forest stand, I think of like a really big scale, several hectares, removing lots of trees, getting them out of there, like a pretty significant operation. And I think that's definitely the wrong word for what I'm suggesting here. I think for these particular situations, it is similar. Like, yes, we are suggesting thinning, but at a really, really small scale. Like, maybe removing a handful of trees in 0.1 of a hectare of a total forest. And so, yes, it's thinning, but it's really, really light. And the area is so small and the treatment is so small that, yes, sun and wind might get in a little bit more, but it's so small that I wouldn't really have that big of an impact. This is kind of tied, I think, to like a broader discussion that's ongoing about how thinning stands can change local site weather. And in this particular context of fire smart, that's really not something I would be super concerned about, just because it's so minor in such a small area. But a great question for sure.
Great. Another individual asks, is it better to chip wood debris from fallen trees versus burning debris?
For me, I think I would say no, just because it takes up a lot of power and things like that to do that, and if it's your only option, it's a way. It's definitely a way of getting rid of fuel on the ground, but definitely it takes up a lot of power, whether it's an engine or whether it's electricity. Uh, it will use up a lot of power just to get rid of one tree. It would take a few hours, right? So uh, if you have a lot of trees on your area that you need to get rid of, it will take a long time.
Yeah, Connor, anything to add there?
No, yeah, I think Joe nailed it. I completely agree.
Great. Okay, another interesting question came up here in our final few minutes. So, someone is asking about summer campfires, and as a fellow backcountry enthusiast, this is a really, lots of people enjoy going out and going into the backcountry and having a fire, or even just sitting in their backyard and having a fire. So, someone says, are they ever justified in the backcountry? Is it a problem that people make their campfires too big to be safe?
Yeah, definitely that's a problem, like people with party fires and that kind of stuff that, if you have a campfire that's, small and you look after the fuel that's around it, you pull it back so that it's not gonna slowly creep away on you and then take off if what wind comes up. A long time ago, we used to, like I said, we had fires 365 days a year because we had to. And, just lately, in the last, 20, 30 years, there have been campfire bans on because people have been using fire the wrong way. If you go to sleep with a campfire, then it could get away on you and destroy housing or camps nearby or whatever. Like Connor said, we have a lot of things built into the forest now that can be put in danger if a campfire gets away. Um, so a lot of education has to go in, to people being respectful of fire and how dangerous it is. And if we can get back to that, then uh, maybe the government will eventually say, yeah, we don't need a campfire ban. Everybody looks after their fire now. But, until that time, we're going to have campfire bans during the summertime. And it's unfortunate. I really like telling stories around fires and, sit there with my, my children and, you know, uh, just spending a night, talking and things like that around the fire.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, it's a really good point, Joe. Yeah. Someone else asks here, so I live on an island that is reasonably terrified of fire. The center of the island is natural regeneration after years of logging. So there's a large buildup of fuel, a lot of ladder fuels, and the real potential for any fire to run into a widespread situation. Crown fire situation. It's been about 100 years since the last fire. There was a pretty recent study and proposal to reduce the fuel load, but the plan included mechanically removing up to 80% of stems in some areas, and it was a pretty heavy-handed approach. There was a community outcry. They are going back to the drawing board and commissioning another plan. We are left with no action on fuel management and a divide between people who want something done and folks who don't want to touch a thing in the woods. Any advice on how we can come together as a community or get some action happening in the woods sooner? And the question is in the chat if you need to refer back to it, as I know it was a pretty long one.
I am happy to answer this question because I am deeply familiar with this type of situation. Um, I think this is always a challenge. I think there can be a divide between people who want to think letting nature do its thing is means doing nothing and letting nature do its thing, and on the other hand, people and that often means a lot of resistance to any type of management. But on the other hand, in this particular situation, it sounds like it's a significant problem. And typically, when there's a significant problem, the solution is also going to be matched up with the significance of the problem. Um, in situations like this, it takes a lot of work and a lot of relationship building and a lot of building of trust to bridge this gap and to maybe on the one hand of the people who don't want anything done, educating them about leaving nature to do its thing means accepting the phenomenon that are part of nature, including severe wildfire. Severe wildfire is a completely natural thing, happens in nature all the time. And if we want to be completely hands off with an area that's been identified as a fire hazard, that means accepting that there could be a significant wildfire with significant impacts to the community. But then on the other hand, if there is someone who's really advocating for this really major undertaking and major approach, I think they also need to accept compromise as well and say that maybe this plan was just, maybe it needs more finer detail, and maybe it was too coarse, and maybe we really need to be focusing at a more micro level scale of where the hazard is, and maybe exploring manual options versus mechanical, or things like that, or maybe reducing the size and being much more strategic and saying, okay, we're going to remove a lot of trees but in a lot smaller of an area, that kind of thing. I know that's a hard, not a great answer. I think this is a really difficult situation, and I think it takes a lot of community champions and a lot of relationship building and a lot of acting in good faith to each other, and being open to compromise from people on all parts of the spectrum on a particular issue like that. I know that's something that I really try to explore and emphasize, because I'm a fire guy. I'm very scared of the impacts of fire, so I tend to be on that heavy-handed side, but I try to make myself open to the concerns of the people who are at the other end, and maybe that's how we meet in the middle and at least get something done. And maybe it's not perfect, but maybe it's just a little bit better than where we were before.
Great answer, Connor. Thank you so much. Joe, would you like to add anything to that before we
Yeah,
wrap?
just really quickly, since we're at 8:30,
Yeah.
yeah, I just want to say, yeah, I agree with Connor, and that the mismanagement of the forest and the public pressure to do nothing. I think the catastrophic fire that we're seeing all over the country, and now we're seeing it on the coast, and it's a sign that it's going to continue and it's going to get worse, and that these catastrophic wildfires are going to happen as long as there's fuel in the forest, as long as there's hot weather during the summertime. There's a chance that the fire could affect your life, and I think the time for doing nothing is past, and that it's time to start getting some action going, and it's time to get into wildfire mitigation, and keep our properties safe, our lives safe, and that kind of stuff. And I wish everybody well, and thank you for the invitation to speak, Cook's Gym.
Thanks so much, Joe. And thank you so much, Connor, as well, for this just incredible discussion and both just amazing presentations this evening. And thank you so much to everyone for attending. We'd love to encourage folks to join us at our groundwater conservation and saltwater intrusion webinar in the Islands Trust area on March 5th from 1 to 3 p.m. Where we will explore the factors contributing to saltwater intrusion, its potential impacts, and groundwater conservation. So if you're interested in that, head to our website for details on how to attend. And just thank you again so much all for attending. Thank you again to Joe and Connor for your amazing knowledge, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Take care, everyone.